The rain had just begun to fall as the honor guard took position at the gates of Valor Heights Military Cemetery. Silence blanketed the crowd, until a voice broke through. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside," said the young officer stiffly, blocking the path of an elderly man who stood hunched beneath a tattered coat. He held no invitation, no uniform, just trembling hands and a faded photograph he wouldn't let go of. "I came to say goodbye to my friend," the old man whispered, glancing toward the rows of generals and dignitaries ahead. But the officer didn't budge. "This is a private funeral, sir. You're not on the list." People around began to murmur, casting disapproving looks at the man who dared to step beyond his station. He lowered his head, retreating slowly, until suddenly the ceremony came to a dead stop. From the distance, a stern voice rose. "Wait." All eyes turned as General Leonard Braxton, the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. Army, strode down the steps, breaking military protocol with each determined step. He was headed straight for the man who had just been turned away. The funeral of General Marcus Ellison was not just a ceremony, it was an event that carried the weight of history itself. Held at Valor Heights Military Cemetery, it was the kind of farewell only reserved for legends. The air was thick with silence and respect. Rows upon rows of four-star generals, admirals, foreign dignitaries, and decorated veterans sat in solemn formation, each wearing their finest regalia. Their medals shimmered beneath the overcast sky, rain gently tapping against their polished caps like a quiet metronome for mourning. Security was tight. No one came in or out without passing through at least 3 layers of protocol. Black SUVs and military escorts had been arriving since dawn, and ceremonial guards flanked every pathway, standing so still they might have been carved from stone. The sound of boots, measured, heavy, and deliberate, echoed softly across the stone pavers. A brass ensemble played softly under a tented canopy, and beyond the arch the American flag-draped casket of General Ellison waited atop a raised platform. There were no flower arrangements at his request, just a single folded flag and his old service cap resting quietly beside it. And then, through the steady drizzle, came a figure that looked like he didn't belong. He was thin, bent with age, and wore a long brown coat that had seen better decades. His shoes were worn so thin the soles bent unnaturally with each step, soaking up the cold mud beneath him. His face was drawn but peaceful, lined with time and memory, not regret. In his frail hands, wrapped in plastic to shield it from the rain, was a photograph. A small, creased, yellowing snapshot. 2 young soldiers in jungle fatigues, laughing with their arms over each other's shoulders. One was unmistakably Marcus Ellison, barely out of boyhood. The other was this man, though younger, with wild hair and a playful grin. Luther Graham had arrived. He didn't push forward. He didn't shout or demand anything. He merely stood, his feet planted just beyond the inner cordon near the great stone arch, looking at the casket like it carried not just his friend, but a part of himself. Eventually, a young military security officer noticed him. The officer approached with caution, eyeing the soaked coat, the unshaven chin, and the lack of a badge or visible credentials. "Sir," the officer said in a voice that tried to balance authority with kindness, "I need to see your credentials." Luther blinked, slow and tired, then looked down. "I don't have any," he said, voice hushed but steady. "I served with Marcus. I just came to honor him." The officer tilted his head, unsure how to proceed. The list of attendees had been vetted for weeks. Background checks, invitations, military clearances. There was no room for surprises today. Before he could respond, a second officer joined, younger, more rigid, fresh from officer school and proud of his clipboard. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply. "He says he served with the general," the first officer said. The younger one stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, this is a classified ceremony. We've got generals flying in from 4 continents. We can't have random civilians just walking in." Luther didn't flinch. His grip on the photograph tightened slightly, as if Marcus might vanish from it if he let go. "I'm not random," he replied. "I'm Luther. Marcus was my brother in arms. We bled together in Tet." There was a pause. The younger officer glanced at his clipboard, flipping pages. "There's no Luther Graham on the list, sir?" "No," Luther said quietly. "There wouldn't be." Around them murmurs began. A few guests seated in the middle rows turned their heads. Some leaned to whisper behind gloved hands. A cameraman from a private military news outlet began to discreetly zoom in. The presence of an unlisted man was a breach of protocol, possibly even a threat depending on how things escalated. The younger officer stepped forward again, voice more formal now. "Sir, unless you're on the approved list, I need you to wait outside the perimeter. This is not a public service." Luther lowered his eyes, the rain now dripping down from the brim of his coat, his slacks stained with water and dirt. He said nothing, just turned back toward the gate. His steps were slower now, heavier though he carried no weight. In his arms, the photograph began to warp slightly from the rain, the edges curling inward like it too was reluctant to face the cold. That's when the air changed. A subtle shift. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was something far more commanding. General Leonard Braxton, the highest-ranking officer in the United States Army and a man known across the globe for his iron will and unbreakable adherence to protocol, had risen from the front row. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait for consensus. He merely removed his gloves, turned, and handed his ceremonial saber to his aide. Then he walked. Down the steps. Through the silence. Boots clapping with purpose against the marble. Past stunned generals. Past reporters and attendants frozen in disbelief. There was no hesitation. No grandeur. Just clarity. Luther had reached the edge of the gate when he heard the voice, deep, authoritative, but layered with something unexpected. Recognition. "Luther Graham?" General Braxton called. Luther froze, half-turned. "Yes, sir," he replied, voice barely audible. And in that moment, with cameras still rolling and every soldier in the cemetery watching, General Braxton lifted his hand in a full salute, high, proud, deliberate. The kind given not just to officers of rank but to men of honor. "You're not only welcome," Braxton said, walking the last few steps, "you belong at the front." The crowd parted as if by instinct. Officers, aides, and generals stepped aside. Even the chaplain paused his breath. Luther stood still, overcome, as the general extended his hand. Luther blinked, unsure whether to salute back or shake it. Braxton smiled faintly and took Luther's trembling hand into his own. "I know who you are," he said softly. "And Marcus never forgot." Then, with his hand on Luther's shoulder, General Braxton turned to the crowd and declared clearly, "This man served with the general in battle. He saved lives when no one was looking. If anyone here deserves a front-row seat, it's him." General Leonard Braxton took Luther gently by the arm, his grip firm but respectful, as though touching something fragile yet immensely valuable. Together, they walked forward, past layers of security that had just moments ago barred Luther's presence. Not a single guard moved to stop them now. At every checkpoint they crossed, soldiers snapped to attention, not for Braxton but for the man beside him. For Luther Graham, the veteran no one had recognized, until now. The crowd parted in silence. Metals clinked faintly. Sabers stayed still. Eyes widened. Whispers moved like a low breeze through the crowd, soft but undeniable. Who is he? Did he really serve with Marcus? Is that the guy from Tet? But no one dared speak aloud. No one moved to challenge the moment. Protocol had stepped aside for history. At the front of the procession, just behind the flag-draped casket and beneath a white canopy lined with wreaths, sat a single empty chair, deliberately placed yet unclaimed. General Braxton stopped and looked at it. "This seat," he said softly, guiding Luther forward, "was meant for you." He pulled it back gently, the metal legs scraping faintly on the concrete. Luther hesitated. He hadn't sat in places like this. Not in decades. He looked around, at the generals, the chaplains, the color guard. And then at the casket. Before he could lower himself into the chair, a hand reached for his, soft, feminine, worn by years of both grace and grief. It was Evelyn Ellison, Marcus's widow. She wore a simple black dress with a strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother. Her silver hair was tucked beneath a modest hat, her hands gloved in soft lace. She looked at Luther as if seeing a piece of Marcus returned to her, He spoke of you until the end, she said gently, her voice trembling. Always, my brother Luther. Always. Luther nodded, but words wouldn't come. His throat tightened. His eyes, still sharp despite age, locked on the casket. So close now. So final. He sat. The chaplain stepped forward. A tall man with a slow, thoughtful cadence, he began the eulogy with reverence. We gather today not only to honor a general but to remember a man. Marcus Ellison was a son, a husband, a father, a leader, and to a few something even deeper, a brother forged not by blood but by battle. Luther didn't blink. His hands rested in his lap, but the photograph never left his grasp. Rainwater had dried on it now, and the edges curled like brittle leaves. He didn't hear much of the eulogy. His mind was elsewhere, in Hugh, in Tet, in the jungle, in the mud, where real honor was silent and survival was earned by inches. Behind him, General Braxton stood still, arms folded behind his back, his cap now removed. But his eyes now and then drifted to Luther. It wasn't just respect that passed through Braxton's gaze. It was penance. He'd read the files, knew the history, and he knew that men like Luther Graham had been buried beneath the silence of others' medals for too long. When the final scripture was read and the folded flag was presented to the widow, taps began to play. The notes, slow and mournful, rose into the gray sky like smoke. 3 volleys rang out in quick succession, the sound echoing across the hills. Luther didn't flinch. Not even a blink. He sat upright, body rigid with muscle memory, eyes unblinking as though looking through time itself. Each rifle crack wasn't a salute, it was a memory. Each note of taps was a name. A place. A promise. Braxton finally leaned down, his voice so low only Luther could hear. Do they know what you did? Luther turned slightly confused. You pulled Marcus from that foxhole in Hugh, Braxton continued. Carried him through sniper fire. Saved 2 others along the way. I've read the report. You never put in for a medal. Never even told his family. Luther shook his head slowly, eyes still on the casket. That wasn't the point, he said. We all did our part. Braxton nodded, jaw tight. And some of us did more. The ceremony ended with the slow closing of the casket. One final salute. One final moment of silence. People began to file out, slowly, reverently. The VIPs first. Then the military units, then the color guard. The brass instruments were packed. Umbrellas opened again. But Luther didn't move. He just sat there, still clutching the photo. That's when General Braxton turned to his aides. Get me Luther Graham's service file, he said, voice crisp. The young lieutenant beside him raised an eyebrow. Sir? Full record. Decorations, citations, everything. Then call Arlington. I want to check the schedule. The other aide, a young woman with a clipboard and wide eyes, leaned in. Sir Arlington? Braxton's jaw clenched. The man deserves more than a seat at someone else's funeral. The aides nodded and scattered, boots tapping quickly on the marble. Luther finally rose, leaning on a borrowed cane from a staff sergeant who had offered it earlier with quiet respect. His knees groaned under him, but he stood tall. His back, though bent, still carried the posture of a man who remembered how to lead. He turned slowly and began walking toward the gate, his coat flapping slightly in the wind. But he didn't get far. Luther, Braxton called. The old man turned. I want to honor you next week, Braxton said, stepping forward. At West Point. Full ceremony. Dress uniforms. Press. The Corps standing at attention. We're going to tell your story, Luther. Luther shook his head gently. General, I'm just a nobody. Braxton stepped closer, voice sharp with conviction. Not to me. And not to Marcus. He placed his hand on Luther's shoulder again, firm but warm. You were the reason he came home. The reason we ever had a Marcus Ellison to follow. That seat today was just the beginning. You're not disappearing into the background again. Luther blinked, unsure how to respond. A strange mix of humility and sorrow rippled through him. Braxton softened. You stood for us when no one saw. Now it's our turn to stand for you. Luther looked back one last time at the casket. Then at the woman who still sat silently beside it, eyes closed in prayer. And finally he nodded. "All right, General," he said quietly. "But I'm not doing it for me." Braxton smiled faintly. "I know." A week later, the auditorium at West Point pulsed with quiet anticipation. Rows of cadets in crisp dress uniforms lined the seats in perfect symmetry, their shoes polished, buttons gleaming under the high lights. Senior officers, some in full regalia, others in understated Class A service dress, filled the front rows. Distinguished guests, veterans, and military families were scattered among them. The walls were adorned with flags, American, Army, POW/MIA, and on the stage a podium stood between two ceremonial honor guards, motionless as statues. But this wasn't a graduation. No, the rising tide of applause that suddenly swept through the room wasn't for a cadet receiving commission, nor for a general stepping into a new command. It was for an old man in a simple navy suit. Luther Graham. He walked slowly, leaning gently on a cane but standing tall with a posture etched into his bones by discipline and memory. Each step echoed softly on the polished floor. His gait was unsteady but his spine, his spirit, remained straight. As the national anthem concluded, Luther reached the center of the stage and paused. His eyes scanned the massive hall. It was surreal. He hadn't stood in a military assembly in decades. Not since his return from Vietnam. Not since those long bitter years when no one asked where he'd been or what he'd endured. The welcome home had been no ticker tape parade, no banners or speeches. Just silence, and the weight of stories he never told. But now he stood before hundreds who were here for him. General Leonard Braxton stood beside him. Once a feared tactician in the upper echelons of the Pentagon, today Braxton looked not like a war planner, but like a man determined to correct a long-overdue injustice. He approached the microphone, adjusted it, and let the quiet hang. Then he began. "Today," Braxton said, his voice firm, "we recognize a man who never asked for recognition. A man who didn't need headlines or medals to know who he was." He turned slightly, nodding toward Luther. Luther Graham served with honor, distinction, and quiet courage in the jungles of Vietnam. He saved lives, held the line under impossible fire, and returned home to a country that was still trying to decide whether soldiers like him were heroes or just reminders of a war no one wanted to talk about. Silence swept through the room. Even the youngest cadets, many barely out of high school, seemed to grasp the gravity in Braxton's words. This wasn't just a ceremony, it was a reckoning. "Many of you," Braxton continued, "know the name General Marcus Ellison. You were at his funeral last week. You've read about his campaigns, his strategic brilliance, his leadership. But what you don't know is this: Marcus Ellison would never have lived long enough to earn his stars, if it weren't for the man standing here today." Luther lowered his gaze, his hands folded in front of him. His cane rested against the podium, and the slight tremble in his fingers betrayed what his face refused to show. "This man," Braxton said, "carried Marcus out of a foxhole under fire, shielded 2 other soldiers with his own body, refused to leave them behind. And when the helicopter lifted off, he was still holding on to Marcus, half-conscious, bleeding but still fighting." He turned toward Luther fully now, stepping aside from the microphone. "You gave us a hero," Braxton said, his voice softening. "And today, we give you the honor you've always deserved." The audience rose to its feet as Braxton reached beneath a velvet-draped table and retrieved 3 items. First, a folded American flag, pristine and creased with solemnity. He placed it gently into Luther's hands. Then a bronze plaque engraved with Luther's name, unit, and the citation for extraordinary valor. And finally, resting inside a small case lined with deep blue velvet, the Army Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military award for valor. Braxton opened the case and pinned the medal to Luther's chest himself. Tears welled in Luther's eyes, and his lips pressed into a trembling line. He didn't cry. Not yet. But the weight in his chest shifted. Some old knot of silence and pain had started to unravel. The room remained standing in thunderous applause. Not because of Luther's posture. Not because of the medal. But because the moment finally gave voice to a lifetime of silence. Later, when the applause had died and the photos were taken, Luther slipped away. Past the aides and press, past the congratulatory handshakes and camera flashes. He found his way to the small chapel behind the stage where quiet reigned. The wooden pews were empty. Candles flickered along the altar. A soft shaft of afternoon light filtered through stained glass. Luther sat alone in the second pew. From the inside pocket of his suit, he pulled out the old photo again. Still creased. Still water-stained from the rain in Arlington. Two boys, maybe 19, arms slung over each other's shoulders in the jungle mud, laughing despite everything. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he whispered, "We made it, Marcus. We finally made it." A single tear slipped down his cheek. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, Luther Graham allowed himself to believe that he had not been forgotten. That someone had been watching. And someone, somewhere, remembered.